I'm going to go ahead and get started, everyone. My name's Liz Garibay. I'm the executive director of the Chicago Brewseum. Thanks so much for joining us. Always appreciate you guys being here for these virtual happy hours and supporting our work and supporting the work of so many of the talented people who make up the Brewseum team. Without them, we really wouldn't have much of an organization, and they've really pulled through for us really in this now full year of a pandemic by being here and presenting in a variety of ways. So I'm excited that we are kicking off 2021 with a virtual conversation with one of the fine gentlemen on our National Advisory Board, Travis Rupp, who is going to talk to us about history of the IPA. For any of you who are on here, just remember, as always, this is your virtual pub, tavern, tap room, whatever drinking space you want. Use the chat room to ask questions and just converse, share what you're drinking. I'm starting out properly with some black English breakfast tea, and then halfway through, I'm going to switch over to the IPA. Just share anything in that chat room. And for those of you on Facebook, also welcome, and please ask your questions in the area below, the comment section below, and we will get to them. And with that, I'm going to bid you adieu for now and pass this over to Travis. Travis.
Thank you, Liz, and thanks everybody for coming out today. And got some heavy hitters that know a lot about this topic already. So hopefully Ron won't say, "No, Travis, you're completely wrong" by the end of this. But no, this should be a lot of fun. Should be a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm Travis Rupp. I know a lot of you in the room, so it's good to see a lot of you from a great distance. It's been years since all of us have been together at a meeting or a conference, but I am a professor of classics, art history, anthropology, and mechanical engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. I also used to work for Avery Brewing Company. I left Avery last year, but I was there for 9 years. And when I was at Avery, I ran the wood cellar program, as well as what we call the innovation program, so new brand development. And I also started a series in 2016 that was called the Ales of Antiquity series. And so my intent with the Ales of Antiquity series was to attempt to recreate some of these historic beers, but not just, as many of you know, when it comes to beer history and trying to recreate beers, a lot of people have a misperception that that's literally just finding a recipe and brewing that recipe. And what I started to discover as a classicist who works primarily in the ancient Greco-Roman world and in Egypt, that really what it comes down to is the process. As we who brew, homebrew, brew on a production scale, whatever it might be, know it really is dependent upon the equipment and how you're doing it, not necessarily just what's going into it. And so this was what I typically used to do at Avery. This is just pictures taken me a few years ago, running the barrel program and doing the things I did there. But in starting the Ales of Antiquity series, I did it primarily for selfish reasons, because as an academic, I was very curious and actually in the beginning quite discouraged that a lot of material that was being published simply said that the Greeks never produced beer. And I found that just way too oversimplified version of history. And having spent quite a bit of time in Greece with my wife and in Turkey, uncovered a tremendous amount of evidence for Greek brewing. And so in 2016, I tried to recreate a Mycenaean beer from roughly 1350 BCE. And I didn't necessarily expect the series to be as popular as it was. Like I said, I didn't really think anybody would want to drink it at all, but it was quite popular, and kind of overnight it turned into a series that was kept me very busy. So from 2016 to 2020, I did 10 different ales of antiquity, and they ranged from ancient Greece to Egypt, Viking beer, ancient Peruvian beer, biblical beer. I had the opportunity to spend about a month with some monks in central Italy in 2017 and reproduce some 9th century monastic beers. And then in the last couple of years, I was focused more on what I would consider much more modern history, looking at our founding fathers, looking at George Washington, and then also Peter Hemmings, the enslaved brewer at Monticello, who brewed beer for Thomas Jefferson. But in the midst there, I also decided to dabble in the IPA story a little bit. I had been working with a division of National Geographic called Global Explorer, who was doing some work in India, and they asked if I'd be willing to do some work on a topic that had to do with India, and I said, sure, let's maybe dig into the story of the India Pale Ale. And so what we're all here today to hear a little bit about was me doing that, an attempt to dig into the history a little bit to see exactly how and why the IPA came about. And again, certainly several individuals in the room today that know a lot about this history as well. But then what I tried to do then was recreate the beer, and not just recreate the recipe, but try to recreate the process of a pale ale that was going to be shipped to India in the middle of Colorado. And it was a very difficult project. It was, of the 10 ales of antiquity, it was by far the hardest one that I undertook. And it was the longest process also that I undertook to get there. So maybe just a little bit of background on the time and the people involved, to get us up to why I chose the year 1752 and why and who I kind of based the process off of. And so just a little background on the time frame. When we go back, say, to the 16th, 17th, and then of course the 18th centuries, certainly in the 17th and then the 18th centuries, there's a tremendous amount of colonization being undertaken worldwide. And this map, I love it. It shows just the major imperial powers that were out there that were trying to completely dictate commerce and try to take over major trades. You'll notice the bright red one on there is the Spanish trade network and system, who was very, very active in the early periods, really dating 16th and 17th centuries. But then, of course, in order to talk about what we're interested in of transport and trade from England or the UK to India, we have to kind of look at the situation from an economic perspective of what was going on at the very, very end of the 16th century in 1599. And we know that there were some heavy hitters in the game, some heavy hitters in regards to shipping and trade distribution and commerce. And they were the Dutch and the English. Now, these two individuals, Jacob Cornelius van Neck on the left, was considered one of the more notable individuals involved in trade from a Dutch perspective, and then of course James Lancaster from an English perspective. And the English were trying to kind of work their way into this massive colonial movement that was going on. Again, the Spaniards were certainly very, very active at this time, and the Dutch, in fact, were the ones that were dominating and dictating a tremendous amount of trade between England and, or I should say, I'm sorry, from the Dutch territories, obviously, to India at that time. But eventually, there were some missions that were undertaken, in particular involving Lancaster again, where in 1601, the English started to get a bit more involved, and they were kind of testing the waters to see not only what was going to be available via these trade networks where they'd have to sweep down around the southern tip of Africa and then into India, but also what kind of military engagements they might be looking at if they undertook these efforts. And up until this point, as I was saying, it was mostly a trade system run by the Dutch. The Dutch East India Trading Company was dominating and dictating all of those maritime trade networks. And eventually, though, the English do get involved and start to do their thing. And in fact, what we would, that is, as I put it here, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading in the East Indies, or what we know as the East India Trading Company, really got its feet under it on December 31st of 1600. We hear that Queen Elizabeth I kind of backed this and put a lot of eggs in that basket, sending 200 English merchants to go trade in the East Indies. And James Lancaster was given 4 ships to try to head to China, or to make his way to China, by 1601. And I'll talk a little bit about what they were actually after, the commodities they were looking to acquire here in just a little bit. But we do know that one of the biggest commodities that he came back with was pepper, and there's a whole story to be told there. Certainly, actually, fairly recently, a new book came out on the history of pepper and its trading via this system. But they were bringing a lot of product back. But there are a lot of interesting stories about James Lancaster, in particular, the Red Dragon, or also just known as the Dragon, which was his primary ship, a 38-gun ship, 600-tonner, that took 5 voyages, undertook 5 voyages for the East India Trading Company. Consequently, one little fun fact about it too that I like is supposedly it was the first live performance, or I should say on board the Red Dragon was the first live performance of Hamlet in 1607 while they were docked at Sierra Leone, which I thought was a very interesting little bit of history, a bit of information there. But eventually the Red Dragon, we don't know exactly, there are 2 different versions of the story of what may have in fact happened to it, but it was laid siege to. Of course, the Spaniards didn't really like the fact that the Brits were getting involved. Neither did the Dutch, especially not the Dutch. And we hear that in a naval engagement, Captain Bonner of the Red Dragon was mortally wounded and died on October 9th. And eventually, then the Red Dragon, it was either captured or sunk. It's not entirely clear which of those 2 events basically happened, but nonetheless, that was kind of the end of these early, kind of, I guess you might say the guys at the front of the line that were getting out there for the East India Trading Company. But nonetheless, though the English were kind of working their way in those early periods, eventually, of course, the East India Trading Company takes control, and it's the reason why we think of it today. Now, this is certainly, as when I've given talks similar to this on this topic before, obviously the symbol of the East India Trading Company became completely synonymous with colonialization, and so it has its own kind of negative context or baggage that comes along with it. But by 1757, and so getting kind of in the same time frame of the beer that I produced to recreate a historic IPA, we know that there was a tremendous amount of ale that was being exported via the East India Trading Company to the Indian colonies. And the question then becomes exactly, what was this ale and why this one in particular? Now, you'll notice there are 2 different kind of images here. On the right-hand side is the coat of arms for the East Indiamen from roughly 1698 or so. But by 1793, we actually know that they had a near monopoly over East India trade. And so they had nudged out and elbowed out a lot of the other big players in the game by the end of the 18th century. Now, there were some periods in there, though, especially at the end of the 18th century, where the East Indiamen were a little bit stifled. I mean, they had a limited activity and productivity following the 7 Years' War, we know. And of course, their resources, that is the British resources, were stretched pretty thin during the Revolutionary War as well. So though there was an impact on some trade and some distribution and commerce because of the major wars that the Brits were fighting, they still were able by 1793 to basically completely monopolize trade to India. But of course, why all of this background and history on the East Indiamen and all this trade? Well, it does obviously play directly into the development of a pale ale that would be for export to India. As I said, by 1757, there was a huge ale boom or I should say ale export boom from Great Britain to India. And when it comes to just the beer trade in general, the imperial beer trade, there was a lot of beer being sent around all over the place. Of course, when we think of even the styles as they still exist today, like imperial stouts or imperial IPAs, that term imperial is certainly used very loosely anymore. And it typically means a very strong alcohol beverage, very high gravity brew. But back then it was more synonymous with literally the fact that they were transporting these high gravity brews to an imperial presence. Namely, a lot of beer was being sent to the Russian imperial system, or to the Russian Empire. And so they were called imperial ales as a result. More on that in just a little bit. But in regards to the beer trade, it was kind of all, it was a worldwide trade already by that point. We don't necessarily, I think even myself at times, I forget at times the worldwide network of beer trade, right? And the fact that it goes back this far is really quite phenomenal, because in the modern era, we're so wrapped up in craft ales, and certainly during the pandemic, I know that there's been a huge movement to drink local, but back then there was a lot of beer being transported very, very long distances. So if they're sending beer from Great Britain to India, why are they doing it? One, but also why are they going there so often? I mean, what is the big thing about the East Indies that they're after? Well, of course, that's obviously a very simple rhetorical question to answer, and it's, of course, the spices. We know that one of the biggest things that they were looking to gain from was the immense spice trade, and ledgers from many of the East India trips by the East India Trading Company indicate that they were going after peppercorns, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and benjamin or frankincense. We also hear of saltpeter, textiles, and opium. Of course, saltpeter has multiple uses, but most notably, it's a major component of gunpowder. And so they were also looking to acquire a lot of these things. And so as they set up this massive trade system between India and the UK, or I should say Great Britain, of course, they were very much going after these. And then obviously the big one is tea. As Liz pointed out, she's kicking things off with a nice breakfast tea, for black tea for the talk today. Tea was a big part of the trade system as well. But as they continued to do this, as they continued to put their foothold on India, Great Britain was also leaving obviously a very heavy British imprint there. There were a lot of colonists that were there that were still looking for items or to acquire things from back home. And that being said, we wonder to what degree exactly the native population or the Indians themselves were interested in this ale that was being imported into their country. Did they have any historical record of beer in India prior? Well, they did, but they weren't largely cereal based, or I shouldn't say millet obviously being used for beer, but they weren't largely barley or wheat based. They did have rice and millet beers that go back thousands of years, and these are the various names that they go by: Sura, Madaka, Prasanna, Handia. And when it came to beer that was being imported, they did like it. In particular, we hear that the locals did like whiskey or strong beer; it was their preferred. And the earliest references we have to it being introduced is European beer being introduced around 1716, and it was pale ale and Burton ale that were primarily being brought in. I'll discuss Burton here in just a little bit as well, and my friends across the pond probably can certainly interject with some commentary on that, how different beer would have been in Burton as opposed to in London, especially considering the water sources. We also know in Kasauli, there was a Kasauli brewery that opened around 1830. It was the first Indian brewery that was opened by a so-called Edward Abraham Dyer, but he was of English-Scottish roots. He was not a local Indian man or Indian himself. Now, so India is obviously acquiring a lot of this product. They're certainly, they're stockpiling, and they literally were stockpiling cask after cask of this ale as it was coming in via the East Indiamen. But back to that idea of the roots of it. What was this beer, and how do we get to the creation of a so-called India Pale Ale? Well, again, a lot of it comes down to the imperial history of the world at that time, and Great Britain, where it existed and where they were producing a lot of these beers, they were making a lot of quote imperial ales or strong ales that were conducted via export to other imperial entities. And I show you, you can of course see the huge footprint of Russia up there as well. And we know a lot of beer was being exported in that direction. In fact, In the 18th century, Thrall's brewery was exporting their imperial beer or imperial ales to Catherine II. 1781, Courage Brewery basically kind of deemed their beer the Russian imperial stout, and were sending this dark ale across to them as well. And they were, again, imperial ales, which essentially were high gravity beers. Now, why high gravity? Why high alcohol? Well, as most, if not all of you know, it's because it's going to hold up much better. You can't really brew like a 5% alcohol pale ale and then send it to royalty in Russia and expect it to taste any good by the time it gets there. And it's because it's going to spoil. And it won't, those beers just don't age very well, especially not in casks as they're being sent over. And so large exports of high gravity beer and brown beer, as it was called in the 17th century, were also being undertaken. And so producing high gravity, producing high alcohol beers in order to export and ensure that they were still of a solid quality by the time they got there. But at the same time, we're talking about a pale ale, right? We're talking about the IPA, the India Pale Ale. Notice that the imperial ales that were originally being exported were high gravity brown beers or browner ales. And we have to talk just a bit about the English Pale Ale before we can actually get to talking about an IPA, because we aren't able to start talking about a pale ale, a pale literally in color ale, until the process of coke kilning. And some of the earliest references to coke kilning and pale malt production come from the late 17th century. Pale malt was largely produced in the North and in the Midlands in Great Britain. And then in the 18th century, we do see the rise of London porters, Burton ales, and pale ales as a result. 1717, the first London brewed pale ale is recorded. And pale ale, though, even though it becomes a more commercial thing by the 18th century, there are references to it being produced in rural communities in the 17th century already, or in the 1600s. Pale ale, the oldest reference from in regards to an advertisement for it comes from 1709. It's the first reference we see to it being sold. And we wonder what the precursor was to it, of course, because certainly it's kind of its own style as it's using these pale malts, and we're seeing the production of a paler ale. But is it possible that the English Pale Ale and what we end up eventually calling the India Pale Ale has a predecessor? Possibly. One theory is that the precursor to it was something called an October Ale. Now, what is October Ale? Well, it seems to have been fondly remembered by several individuals, authors and artists alike. Sir Joshua Reynolds here, you see an artist and beer lover. He was said to have enjoyed October Ale from the frozen regions of Russia to the burning sands of Bengal and Sumatra. And in particular, this October Ale was an export ale. And it was produced at the time of year in October for export, and it was being exported to Baltic countries. It was darker, amber to brown in color, so not necessarily a pale ale. But when it was being produced at home, what was being produced at home, I should say, was all pale malt varietals of this, high ABV and high IBUs, or international bittering units, are essentially just using a lot more hops. And so in order to create these export versions of it, or the local versions using pale malts, you're talking about a fairly expensive process. These were beers that were for the wealthy, not for the working, because a lot of ingredients have to go into them to make them, one, high gravity, but obviously also to make them high IBU. In order to get a higher bitterness unit, you've got to produce or put in more isomerized alpha acids from hops, or just in general add more hops. So October Ale recipes prior to the IPA movement or the pale ale movement were ultra expensive in consideration of the times. Lots of malt needed to get the gravity up, and there are estimates that it may have been upwards of 10 to 12% ABV. Pale October malt, when it started to kind of take over, though, or as it started to nudge some of these darker versions that were being used for export out of the way, we do know that they were hopping at twice the rate of brown October Ale. which was equivalent to nearly 5 pounds per barrel to in a ratio of 5 pounds per barrel for the pale to 2 pounds per barrel for the brown. And that's unbelievable. I mean, coming from what I was doing at Avery, I mean, most of our IPAs at Avery were obviously they're using pelletized hops most of the time, but even when we would use whole cone hops, you rarely would use more than 2 pounds per barrel for dry hopping, even with whole cone hops. To use 5 pounds per barrel, that's unbelievable, and the cost is just unbelievably outrageous. These beers as well, these October ales, both pale and dark, would be aged in oak for 9 months to upwards of 3 years. Of course, this was going to impart color also over the course of time. So how pale they truly were after 9 months, it was probably a far cry from what they looked like when they originally went into the oak. And I can even attest to that using lightly toasted oak for the project that I undertook. I'm actually drinking it right now. The SRMs on this are much higher than they were when I originally produced it. The SRM I think I was targeting, I don't recall right off the top of my head, it might have been like 6 or somewhere in that ballpark. And I think the SRMs came in a little closer to like 10. So, and that was just from being an oak for about 4 months, what I ended up doing. More on that in a little bit. But I did reference earlier the Burton concept, and I think what is interesting, especially well, and it makes a lot of sense. A lot of the histories that are written about pale ale and the IPA industry in particular often talk about Burton-on-Trent because it does become one of the largest producers, in fact, the largest producer of pale ales, and also a major exporter of India pale ales during this period. And it's often considered kind of the beer epicenter in British culture. But what's really intriguing is in order to recreate the process of making an 18th century India Pale Ale, obviously the most important ingredient is the water. And water is making up the vast majority of the beer you consume, right? And so it's the most important ingredient. And water from one source to the next is nowhere near the same. And consequently, the water on Trent and the water from the Thames in London are drastically different. And I will show you the contents, the sulfide and calcium contents in both water sources, at least dating back to the early 20th century. And what was noteworthy about it, as I mulled it over with my team, we're getting ready to recreate this. I went for a London-based brewery, as I'll discuss in a moment. But the Burton water would have probably increased hop bitterness because of its chemistry. It also would have been a very interesting, hopefully at some point I'll get the opportunity with my new project with the Beer Archaeologist LLC to try to recreate a historic Burton ale, because the chemistry there would have caused an interesting activity or an interesting reaction from the yeast in particular. We almost wondered how the yeast would even stay in suspension long enough to fully ferment the beer. More on that also in a little bit. But Burton undoubtedly were big players in the export game. And of course, some of the biggest names that came out of that that we still think of today, like Bass or Alsop, are conducive to the story of the India Pale Ale. They often were producing early on, that is Burton-on-Trent was producing beers around 30 degrees Plato and coming in around 10% ABV. Now at 30 Plato, it means there was still a lot of residual sugar left behind. So they were probably fairly thick and sweet even at 10% ABV. Sorry, I shouldn't say hooping there, it should say hopping ratios of about 5.2 pounds per barrel. And there are sometimes credited by some histories as being the birth of us seeing the birth of the Imperial IPA. But the reason why I wanted to look at London a little bit more distinctly was obviously we do know there's this name that comes up all the time. And many of you here today have probably heard of this guy. His name comes up a lot, George Hodgson. A lot of just general histories that you'll look at for the birth of the style will reference George Hodgson as the creator of the IPA. And we can't necessarily say he created it, but undoubtedly with Bow Brewing, he was one of the largest exporters of India Pale Ale from London during the 18th century. Now, 1752 is when the brewery opened. Why Bow Brewing? Is it's near Bow Church, and I kind of just show you this part of London that you see here. He was originally producing mostly porter and October ale for the East Indiamen, but the idea for export of pale ale goes, if you're going to be sending it to colonists in their colonialist efforts, you probably don't want to be spending as much money on your product as you're spending to send to the Russian Empire, for example, or to somebody of higher affluence. And so the question was, how does he, or how do any of these brewers at the time, find a way to make pale October ale at a lower cost to produce? Because again, ultra expensive beers with a lot of ingredients in them. And if you're going to turn a profit on these beers and you're going to get the East Indiamen to want to buy into your product and send it, you got to make it cheaper. We know he was very successful at it, though. There are some remaining ads in the Calcutta Gazette from 1801 and 1809 that reference Bow Brewing as one of the major exporters of India Pale Ale at the time. Now, in 1813, Hodgson and his son were shipping about 4,000 oak barrels a year via the East Indiamen, and they eventually would open a new facility. They opened a new brewery near Bow Bridge with a tap house called the Bombay Grab, and things were good. They were certainly proliferating in their productivity. And to that degree, it's often recorded that Bow Brewing Company was considered the most successful brewer of IPAs. And we'll talk a little bit about how he was able to get the cost lower and what that meant for him. But being the most successful brewer of IPA doesn't always mean that the story is going to end all hunky-dory and well. And it seems that his successors were very greedy. They managed to royally piss off a lot of the ship captains in the East India Trading Company because they were pocketing a lot of money and undercutting the cut, literally, it was supposed to go to the ship captains. And then in 1822, the East India Trading Company Board of Directors commissioned Samuel Alsop to replicate Hodgson's beer. Literally said, Alsop's, you guys figure out how to make what he's doing at this less expensive cost, and we're going to jump ship because we're getting screwed, basically, is what they realized. And when Alsop started creating, after they did figure out, it's a very, very simple recipe, but more just trying to figure out a cleaner, more standardized process for it. Supposedly, Alsop's beer was cleaner and hoppier. And eventually what happened to Bow Brewing is 1863, it was bought out by sought out by Smith Garrett. And the brewery itself, the newer brewery near the Bow Bridge, was eventually demolished in 1933. So it met its fate, obviously decades and decades later, literally over a century later, but essentially that's what happened to it. So Bow Brewing, why did I target this as the beer to recreate? Well, there were two reasons. One, again, was that it was credited as having been one of the largest exporters and one of the most successful financially exporters of India Pale Ale during the time. I also found it really interesting that it was located in London because so many stories lead to Burton. And so the ingredients, as I said, according to his own ledgers, are very, very simple. It was essentially these things: pale malt of 2-row or 4-row variety. And I know some of you are aware, but yes, that's not a typo. 4-row was a malt that did once exist. It no longer does. We produce beer via 2-row or 6-row malted barley. 4-row was a very popular malt that was actually used by the Brits for an extended period of time. There are various theories as to exactly what happened to it, but it seems to have maybe been over cultivated, and eventually it just kind of died off and was replaced, rightfully so, from a more macro brewing perspective, by 2-row, because 2-row is a very, very efficient crop and yields very, very high. And so 2-row certainly comes in as a result. Hops were East Kent Goldings or some derivative of it, some predecessor. of what we call kind of this old world hop. And then the yeast would have been something probably along the lines of a London ale yeast. And so obviously, since I can't get the exact ale strain from what George Hodgson was using, I went with a London ale strain when I recreated the beer. Y yeast London ale strain in particular. 1028 is the designation if you buy your yeast from Y yeast. But then, as I was saying earlier, in regards to water chemistry, that was the big one. And what I found so unbelievably interesting, and again, I got to credit John Palmer and his work in his water book, as well as his other book on brewing and home brewing as well. He talks about water chemistry quite a bit, but digging through his extremely difficult and cerebral book on water, he had some references to historic records on water chemistry from various bodies of water, and the Burton and London chemistry was available. So I dug back as far as I could find in my own research and library sources here at the University of Colorado, and I got as far back as the early 20th century. And these were the profiles of calcium and sulfates in the water. And you'll notice that they're very, very, very different. Now, the London water profile was not as difficult to reproduce because our water in Colorado is very clean. It really is Rocky Mountain filtered water. So when really all the breweries that exist in this area, none of them have water treatment plants. We don't need them, but we typically have to add a lot of mineral content back to the water for yeast health. And so essentially we had to bump the calcium and the sulfates in the water, but we were able to get there. Burton numbers, though, you'll notice are really, really, really high. And just from experience with water that has this high of a calcium content, sulfite or sulfates as well, is that with the sulfates being that high and the calcium, really just both numbers combined, yeast wants to flocculate or go anaerobic and fall out of suspension pretty fast. And so I find it interesting. And like I said, I would love at some point to try to recreate this because, the historic record seems to indicate that the Burton ales may have been, the originators of the Imperial IPA and these high gravity pale ales. But I think it'd be really curious to see how well the yeast does in that kind of water condition. Obviously, they still brew beer there today too, so it's not like beer wasn't successful. It was obviously very successful there. Beer was then, from Hodgson's perspective, then was dry hopped for shipment. And these are obviously pelletized hops just in a bucket. This is just a stock photo, but he would, for shipment, add more whole cone hops to the barrels, and he had an apparatus, presumably, or it's been referenced, it basically was like a spring-loaded plunger where he could pop it through the bunghole, shove the hops down, and then if you pulled it out, it would spring back the other way and the flaps would come out of the bung. And they would pack in these extra dry hops for shipment, and then it would be on its way. So essentially, if you were in London at the time, you were drinking the same beer that went to India. It's just you were drinking it fresh and it wasn't given this added dry hopping step. And so it was just an additional couple of steps essentially to get the beer ready for export. But that being said, remember, as I was saying before, Hodgson figured out a cheaper way to make it. And the idea of making it cheaper was he had to bring down the grist or bring down the malt bill because it was far too expensive to produce an imperial style. And he also had to figure out a way to bring down the hopping ratio to make it more financially responsible. But of course, as you bring those things down, as you bring down the ABV and you bring down the bittering units, you start to get into a territory where you're opening up the beer for spoilage. Of course, with the higher gravity, higher alcohols will deter or kill off most bacteria that might try to grow in beer. The lower it comes down, though, obviously that's going to be a problem. Also, with IBUs, with hops actually are natural preservatives. Having run the sour program at Avery, we got to a point where we had to have produced beer for souring. The base beer had to be as low IBUs as we could construct, really, because if you got over about 30 IBUs, sour bugs like Lactobacillus pediococcus, and then even wild yeast like Brettanomyces could not do their work. And so if he brings that IBU number down too low, the beer is going to spoil as well. So there's kind of this game that has to be played. What's the line that's drawn to still get a quality product to India that still makes you financially successful? Now, it's worth noting, just as a side note, in the interest of time, obviously I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but IPA was not also just being produced by the Brits. There was IPA being produced in Scotland as well. And they really did build off of their anecdotes told from the early 19th century about them kind of building off of Hodgson's method. Robert Disher in Edinburgh in 1821 produced quite a bit of IPA for export. And many Scottish breweries, in particular, Disher's brewery was supposedly producing more IPA than even the Burton breweries early on. They're also credited at times with the invention of sparging, so the idea of adding hot liquor or water, as we call it in the beer industry, back to the top of the mash in order to force, basically via hydrostatic pressure, to drive that heavier sugar water through the grain bed to get a higher gravity wort product. And they capitalized off of a high demand and low shipping costs at the time. So they were involved as well. But there was a lot being exported. As I said, a lot was being loaded onto ships, a lot sent out. And of course, these are much later images because they didn't have the ability to take photographs back in the 19th century, but, or I'm sorry, not they did eventually in the 19th century, they didn't in the 18th century, that is. But you know, the cooperage yards are very telling of the vast majority of not only spirits that were being produced at various times, but also beer for export. And in order to recreate the process, this is a critical cog in the wheel of, again, you know, doing experimental archaeology or recreating a beer. One can easily just get the recipe and brew it, but that's not really going to give you a very valid perception of what the beer might have tasted like. You know, I don't think anybody can ever truly 100% reproduce a historic or ancient beer because there are so many variables at play. But if you're going to do it, you got to take this into account, and it would be stored on ships for a minimum of approximately 11,000 nautical miles and sent, again, if it was George Hodgson's brewery, sent from London all the way to a variety of locations in the East Indies, or really anywhere in India, not even just the East Indies. So I looked at a lot of references to and research on where these barrels might be stored. And most of them pointed to a hold that you can see is right here at the waterline. And then I started thinking, or started wondering, well, what was the ratio of boats that would hold the barrels below the waterline versus those above the waterline? They were using the barrels as essentially ballast as well, because obviously they're very heavy. Your standard 53-gallon whiskey barrel in the United States, when it's full, weighs about 600 pounds. And so you put all these down in the bottom of the boat, they are really good ballast. But what was actually quite discouraging was it kind of just varied. It all just depends on where they fit in the boat. Some were below the waterline, some were above, some were right at the waterline. And why this was of interest to me was, of course, if I'm going to replicate the journey from London to India, I have to take into account the temperature swings. And the shipment or the trip could last a pretty extended period of time. It could be 3 months, it could be 6, sometimes even 18 months to get there, depending on where they went. Some of the East India men stopped off in South America first and then hopped over. So it just depended on how many stops they had along the way. The shortest being direct shipments, which were about 3 months in length. And of course, you can see all the various destinations they might land at. So that's a long journey. And it's a lot of temperature zones, a lot. And it does matter if they were being held below or above the water level or the water line of the boat, because it does vary the temperature by a couple of degrees Fahrenheit. And so looking at it and just looking at average temperatures for water temps, and going more based off of what the ambient temp then might be in the hold, based on what the water temp was outside. I ended up having to look at fluctuations, and I'll do it in Fahrenheit, which was anywhere from about 40 degrees Fahrenheit all the way upwards of about 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, for a modern brewer, this is a freaking nightmare. Like, this is exactly what you do not do to a beer. You don't take it and fluctuate it back and forth from temperature extremes like that. And you can see that it goes from cool to hot to cool back to hot on its journey. And it comes into play, and there's this question of spoilage. Then, did the beer spoil, and was Hodgson putting all this extra hops in to prevent the beer from spoiling? Well, I don't really think that's necessarily the case. I mean, he was certainly putting it in there to try to make a more profoundly, you might say, consistent product by the time we got to the other location. But you can have beer spoilage with that high of a hop content just from all these temperature fluctuations. And it led, of course, doing footnote chasing and everything else when you're doing this kind of research. It led some to wonder if, was spoilage a concern for Mayflower's brown beer in 1620 when it came across, because it didn't even have nearly the hop content that one of Hodgson's India pale ales would have had, or just pale ales for export to India is essentially what they were. Of course, also, it wasn't the only thing being kept in the hold. There were a lot of other things, a lot of food sources, salted beef, brine pork. You see the whole list of things that we know were kept on board as provisions for the crew, but also that would be offloaded once they got to India for this trade and sale system and commercial system. But really, at the end of it all, when it gets to the other destination, it has to be palatable, right? You need to be able to drink it. Of course, as you get over there, we start to wonder, were they able to really consume this beer? If you're fluctuating a beer from, this is just hypothetically, saying from like 42 degrees Fahrenheit, gradually bringing it up to 86 degrees, dropping it back down around 45 to 50 degrees, and then bringing it back up to around 80 degrees ambient temp over the course of even the smallest distance of 3 months or 18 months at its extreme. My Lord, that doesn't sound like it's going to be a very tasty thing in the end. And it just all depended on where they ended up, right? These are just to select some of the principal trade hubs in the East Indies that they might end up. So when it got to India, the beer also was then stored, and it was stored in large warehouses. Obviously, this is a modern warehouse, but it could be stored in really, really large warehouses. And records indicate for up to 18 to 24 more months. So all of you who have, any palate for IPAs, love IPAs, I'm sure the fresher the IPA, the better. You're supposed to, especially from a craft American IPA standpoint, their shelf life, it doesn't really extend much beyond 60 days, even though a lot of breweries try to put a shelf life of 90 to 120 days on it. It starts to oxidize and taste like cardboard pretty quickly after about 60 days because the IBU content's so high. Now, these IBUs, based on trying to recreate his profile, hot side IBUs, so meaning after the beer was brewed, not dry hop, but after it was brewed, they came in when I recreated it around 30 to 34 IBUs. Now that's pretty low, but it still would have oxidized over the course of time. So for it to be in a warehouse then for 2 more years, I mean, they could be drinking IPAs that were 3.5 to 4 years old when they finally tapped the casks. But we also have to remember that, of course, these beers are in oak. One, they're not being put into bottles or cans like they are today. So there's other flavors that are going to be imparted into the beer. More on that in a little bit, as well as I talk about how it turned out. Now, just as a quick side note to get us to that point of talking about the process of recreation, do these 18th century IPAs exist anymore? Not really, but there, some of the names that coincide with them do. Bass, Ratcliffe, Gretton, and Gretton on Burton on Trent. Single brew barley wine #1 or Bass #1 are often considered to potentially be correlatives to that. Ron, you probably have a little bit more on that you can interject. And then British barley wine becomes the British barley wine standard. Dark Bass beers take over, of course, and starting gravity about 25 degrees Plato, typically in excess of 10% ABV. And then Bass #2 came later. But in regards to what Hodgson was creating or what some of these other 18th century breweries were creating, I don't know if we can necessarily say that the IPA that was being mass exported is really around much anymore. And some of these, obviously the ones that still exist are closer to maybe October ales than the India ales. And I would say just overall, when you look at general histories, I'm talking about general histories, not all the scholarships out there, because there's some really good things written on the topic. I mean, Mitch Steele's book on IPAs, it was a phenomenal read when I started doing the research, just to kind of get my head on straight before I started digging into this a few years back. And I think the history is really riddled with a lot of things: presumptions, misnomers, muddled information, misinformation, just general lack of documentation as well. When we don't have the primary sources to rely on, it can be really difficult to fully repaint the picture. Also, inconsistencies, especially in information. Each brewery's approach to the beer, and from batch to batch, we don't have all of that data to necessarily look at. So these gross generalizations are made about what IPA was and what it must have been. And so, as I said, to create the beer, to recreate it, I did have the recipe. It was very simple and straightforward, really. 100% two-row, pale two-row is what I used. All from English-born maltsters. So everything came from Simpson's. 100% East Kent Golding hops, and hot side target. I went for 50 IBUs. It came in, though, like I said, around 34. Of course, dry hopping is going to add perceived hoppiness or bitterness to the beer, but because the hops are not isomerized, there's no isomerized alpha acids, that is, via heating, then it's not going to actually affect the IBU number. If anything, as a matter of fact, the more dry hops you put in, it can actually reduce the finishing IBU number. It can actually pull bittering units out of the beer as it sinks to the bottom of a container, as some recent scientific research from about 3 or 4 years ago validated, which was really interesting. Like, for example, at Avery, when we would brew Maharaja, which was our Imperial IPA, it was ridiculous. We brew it at 104 IBUs. And we didn't really measure, we would never really care to measure the IBUs after dry hopping. Well, it turned out that after dry hopping, what was at 104 on the hot side was about 80 to 85 after dry hopping, because it would pull those isomerized alpha acids out, which was really quite interesting. So we changed our methodologies as a result. But nonetheless, this is the brew house at Avery, where, like I said, I worked there for 9 years. That was the recipe. We did barrel it. This was my little mad science lab where I was doing all of the ales of antiquity with my colleague and good friend Colin Quinn here, helping me with that program. After we barreled them, what I did also do was I actually left, I intentionally left a bit of headspace in the barrels, because I was working on under constraints, because it was obviously a macro brewing facility. Or I shouldn't say macro. It was a large scale, medium sized brewing facility. And so I had basically about 3.5 weeks to do the project. And so I actually tried to promote oxidation to see what would happen, and abuse, because when I say abuse, if I'm going to ship this on a boat, I also have to rock the barrels. And so we actually did. During fermentation, we would rock them while we were there during the day. We'd roll them around on the floor until they got going. And this is my former colleague, Andy Parker, who's now the director of innovation at Denver Beer Company, who actually started the barrel program at Avery about 18 years ago, showing just how happy the yeast was, because it really did take off and rage, and it fermented in the oak for about 14 days. And then after that, of course, after the 14 days of it doing its thing, we did dry hop it, and we dry hopped it with whole cone East Kent Golding hops at 2.8 pounds per barrel. And I already talked a little bit about how that might have affected the IBUs in the long run. And then we would shake them, and we would roll them around, and I would also move them around on a daily basis on forklifts. But also I had to mimic the temperature swings. So I mapped how long it would take to get from it to each temperature zone, essentially, in a 3.5 week window, and what the temperature swing needed to look like. So over the course of 3.5 months, this thing was taken back and forth from about 40 degree Fahrenheit temp to 86 to 45 and then back up to 80 while repeatedly rocking and shaking the barrels. Now, this beer almost reduced me to tears a few times because we'd taste it in process and it was awful. I mean, it just was not, there was so much yeast in suspension. Also, interestingly enough, it actually started fermenting again. I was really curious how it would do, basically carbonizing in the barrel, and it did carbonize itself in the barrel because of this constant back and forth temperature swing. So it wasn't very high. When we finally debarreled it, it was holding at just under 1 bar pressure of, one volume, not bar, 1 volume of pressure with CO2. So that's, maybe about 28 to 30% of what you're going to get in a standard IPA today for carbonation. But it's still interesting to see it kick back in and actually carbonate in the oak. And then we did filter it. There were records of it after being debarreled here, just some of the crew helping me debarrel it. We filtered it. I shouldn't say we did not filter it. We did use finings, though. There were some indications that they may have had finings, which will help, the solids coagulate, stick to it, and pull it out of suspension. So we ran it through finings, and the window indicated in some of the research, and it didn't really do much to it. Finings, typically, you got to add a really large. You've got to give it enough time and add the appropriate amount. And it didn't seem like they were using exactly the appropriate amount. I did find it comical. There were some references to potentially them filtering the beer through flannel. We did not do that. I didn't think any consumer out there needed, some Axe deodorant flavored beer or something like that. And then we did eventually can the beer into these 4-packs. And this happened in November of 2019. Beer came in at 7.7 ABV, 34 IBUs was the final product. Now, I'm sitting here sipping on one right now, and this is an IPA that is a year and 3 months old since it came out of oak. So this is approaching essentially what it, in terms of time, what it would have been like to crack one in India. But of course, this has been in a can, and I keep it in my beer cellar in the basement, so it's been treated very well. Who knows how well it was treated in those warehouses. But what I found very interesting to rewrite the record of the flavor was following the guidelines, following the recipe, following the process to the best of my ability, even literally beating the living bejesus out of this beer, right? Left headspace to promote oxidation, shook the living hell out of these barrels on a daily basis. Only Saturdays and Sundays, sometimes they didn't get shaken. And we had 26 of them, so we were really tired at the end of each day rolling these things around, fluctuating the temperature, doing all these things to it. And it turned out quite nice. It didn't taste good during the process, but when it was all done and put into package, it is not particularly hoppy. And I think a lot of that's because you have a lot of other flavor profiles at play, but it's also mostly EKGs or East Kent Golding hops, which are fairly earthy, and a little more subdued than some of the American counterparts. But because it was done in oak, which I used a combination of English and Virginia white oak for this project. They were actually barrels left over from my brewing of George Washington Porter the year before. And we know a lot of these barrels being traded back and forth between England and the colonies, the early American colonies. And so I basically reuse those oak. And of course, because they're not just going to throw them away, they're going to reuse them. But there are all kinds of kind of interesting components to it. Some spicy content. Vanilla comes through a little bit. It has the banana has gone away a little bit, but it still has banana notes. But it does have a really nice little tannic oak backbone. And I don't think most people would pick this up. Nobody really would pick this up and be like, "Oh, that's an IPA," because it doesn't really taste like one. It's something very different. Now, what happens in the last few minutes here, then to the IPA trade or trend? Well, of course, it's a very different thing when it comes to the Americas. And obviously in the United States, it's our best-selling craft beer style is the IPA, the India Pale Ale. And having spent a lot of time in the UK, one of my favorite places to be, wish I was supposed to be there again in 2020, but of course that did not work out very well with the pandemic. But nonetheless, obviously, pale ales are a very different bag of chips there. And the hoppy pale ales, English IPAs, are very different as well. And so who's really credited with kicking off you know, the what we consider like the IPA trend in in the United States. Well, a lot of it is credited to Ballantine Brewery, who produced the so-called Ballantine IPA that lasted for a very, very long time, 1890s all the way up to the 1990s, and you can kind of see the statistics on it there. And it was started by a Scotsman, Peter Ballantine. And honestly, he's credited with having really started the whole profile in general. He did a lot of work in the upper Northwest in regards to starting what has become a mecca for hop growers. And of course, this is just a major hop field up in Yakima Valley. Or I should say, he was kind of working with that trend, working with the idea of building this profile. And then the really great American IPA revolution, Burt Grant and Yakima Brewing and Malting Company certainly credited. Born in Scotland, 1928, moves to Toronto in 1930, and then 1967 starts the project at Yakima, helps build two, or I should say, helps build and operate two hop processing plants. And then Yakima Brewery opens up, and we have our microbrewery revolution to a degree, and the extended use of hops. A whole different topic and a whole different kind of talk. And other people have done more research on this period than I have. That could be a follow-up to that. But American hops are very different. And so I think one of the reasons why hopefully the project I did was able to kind of rewrite any kind of story that revolves around the original IPA or even just the 18th century IPAs is that they just aren't what we should expect them to be. And they just weren't. I mean, certainly for us, American in the United States, American hops are just a totally different thing. They're a totally different animal, certainly driven by Cascade hops, although Cascades are not the most popular hops being procured by craft brewers now, but they were for a long period of time. When they were designed in 1971 by the USDA. And American hops are considered big, bold, they have attitude, dank, piney, all that kind of stuff. And that's not what these IPAs were. They weren't even really necessarily that, right? They were pale ales that were being shipped to India, and they just happened to have a larger hop content. So to conclude then, it was a fun project to work on, and hopefully I'll continue to work more on it. As of late, with my new ventures as the Beer Archaeologist and then working at the University of Colorado, I've kind of opened up my world. So I'm working a lot more on not just alcohol, but food. And I know actually some of my students are here today, so they know that I'm teaching this graduate course on mechanical engineering, literally equipment and production methodologies and technology and ancient food and alcohol production now. So it's been a lot of fun to open my world to all these different things, not just beer. But that doesn't mean that my projects on beer are dwindling by any means. And I have a lot of them going. This year, I'm working extensively on Rome and Britain, which is why I've been in the UK as much as I have as of late, working on Hadrian's Wall. I am a Roman archaeologist by trade, so the two worlds are coming together, which is nice. Continuing on the founding fathers as well, working on James Madison, doing a project on Stonehenge as well, and a lot more to come as things keep going and people keep showing interest, hopefully in the work, using beer as a lens to view history, as I always say. If you want to see what else I'm doing or follow me, I'm mostly active on Instagram or Facebook. So these are my handles for Instagram and Facebook. And then, as I said, just recently started my own project, the Beer Archaeologist LLC. So coming, hopefully in the next couple of months, I'll be launching a new website, the Beer Archaeologist. They'll be hosting a lot more content in regards to the work I'm doing, work others are doing. And yeah, just keep cranking along, because man, is it fun to be a beer historian, right? So, and with that, I'm going to say cheers, and I'll open it up to any questions. So cheers to you all.
Thanks, Travis. Cheers, everyone. I will start by saying that Travis is, of course, a wealth of knowledge, and we're fortunate that he's also on our National Advisory Board for the Brewseum, and he will be doing a few things for us this year and the bigger picture of our project. So you'll definitely hear more from Travis and the Brewseum together. You just see in the chat that Lucas opened it up and said, hey, please ask your questions in the chat, or feel free to put yourselves on video and unmute yourselves. This is sort of the communal part of the experience, that thing we're all missing. Ask some questions. We're also very fortunate to have here right now as well, and fortunate that the Brewseum also has so many great team members. A few folks who are located in the UK or near the UK, somewhere in Europe, but are experts also on this topic. So a wealth of knowledge that we have right here. But in the meantime, please go ahead and ask your questions, or let's have this conversation to continue this discussion about the history of the IPA.
And I'll see, I'm sorry, I wasn't watching the chat as I was yakking here. So if there were some questions earlier on, Lucas, if you've got them targeted, feel free to just shout them out, or anybody can just kind of shout out what they are.
Yeah, I'll say that if you did ask a question at some point, I would kindly ask that you re-ask it, only so that we don't have to scroll, and there's a lot of also fun banter, which I love. So if you did ask
Good.
a question, please retype it or unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask. We'll do that.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. Lucas, you brought up and I can see a few of those regarding the voyage, and then the calcium or chloride, calcium. Oh yeah. So yeah, sorry. I think it's, I may have actually, did I keep saying calcium? It should have, or I should have said calcium, and I may have miswrote it with CL. It's supposed to be calcium. So I apologize on that. So yes, it is calcium, not chloride. So the calcium and sulfate content. But in regards to, let's start first with how long was the voyage. So like it could really vary a lot. But the shortest references in any kind of ledgers were direct trips. So which were very rare, to be honest. It's really not going to happen very often that those ships are going to take off from London and really not make landfall again until they get to India, or just stop off and not offload or onload anything. But there were a few references to it taking right around 3 to 3.5 months if they were really hightailing it. 4 months in there, so about a 3 to 4 month window. What was way more common was to see about 12 months to 18 months. And the 18-month ledgers seem to have indicated much more that they were stopping off in South America. Mark, you might know a lot about this as well on that. I'm not sure if you do, but they would, the really long journeys, if they were offloading anything in South America, would usually add an additional 6 months onto the trip. So it's a pretty long journey. Now, in regards to, and I apologize, that is a typo on my part in the slideshow. So I am talking about calcium and sulfates in the water content, not chloride. Apologize on that. And so, the calcium content, that's just unreal that it was that high. Now, like I said, I can only go back to the beginning of the 20th century. That's the oldest information I could find. And again, I know I've got a lot of fellow beer historians here today. So even Ron or Peter, if you guys know anything about it as well, but they're really, really high at that time. Now, some of the theories that I've read regarding water chemistry from those water bodies indicate that the water may have just been really, really dirty at the turn of the 20th century because of the Industrial Revolution, essentially. And so what we're measuring in regards to that mineral content may be grossly inaccurate. And so that's what I want to dig in a little bit more on. The Thames, though, seemed pretty straightforward. And again, working with John Palmer's studies, it seemed pretty spot on that was appropriate. Yeah. Other questions? And feel free to just holler, guys. You don't have to type it. Don't be shy. Lucas says one via Facebook, when they used the term pale, was it golden or more of an amber color? It was actually quite golden. If you get a good clean pale malt, you're via coke kilning, you're really not going to impart any color. Most of the color that was being imparted in that malt, of course, is coming from products that literally smoke, almost like smoking the wood, that was imparting color into the malt. And so it was quite pale. And to be honest, it probably wasn't going to be like your Coors Light or Coors Banquet poured into a glass. I mean, that's just so ultra filtered that there's almost no SRM left. But you're going to get a nice golden color. You're not going to really get amber much out of them. Anything else? Sure, there are.
I'm sure there are too. All these folks in here. Yeah, please go ahead and unmute and just go ahead and ask the question. Um, and Ron and Mark, if you guys.
I guess I got a question here, Travis.
Yeah, I wanted to say.
No, go ahead, Ron.
I'm sorry, I don't want to. You go ahead. I'm not gonna blow you out here.
No. Your question's, I'm sure, far more intellectual than my question.
Yeah, I've forgotten what I was going to say though. So,
Okay.
so you go ahead.
All right. So your opinion there, Travis? Milkshake IPA and New England IPA. Should we call them IPAs or something different?
That was a good question. So I will tell you. So when I left, that was it's still the big trend, and I personally am so over the hazy IPA thing. I think that you can call hazy IPAs okay. Milkshake IPAs, I don't know. I mean, I would almost say no, because when we think about India Pale Ales as the trend has become, we're expecting something that's very hop driven, and I actually really miss the old West Coast IPA movement, the ones that would just smack you in the face with really, really aggressive hops. And that, I think it's going to come back, to be honest. I mean, these beer trends swing so much, but hazy IPAs, I suppose, at the same time, though, there's a lot of debate on this in the beer world too, because most hazy IPAs, their IBUs aren't going to be above 30, and they aren't the driving factor. Typically well, I should say the bittering hops are not the driving factor. It's all the aromatics. So it's all the hops that are added in dry hopping. And that's how you get your blueberry notes and, your pine notes, whatever it might be. And so I'm going to say no on milkshakes, but yes on hazies, as long as the IBUs are high enough. That's my personal opinion.
Travis,
yes, Peter,
with your recreation, did you have any Brett influences from the barrel, or was it not in the barrel long enough?
Excellent question. I should have brought this up. No, I actually thought I would get quite a bit of Brett character, just because so in our sour program, Brett always would kick off first, and we'd start getting that funk from the Brett in the product pretty early on. You can start sensing it. And we did all of our sours in oak. So you'd start getting the Brett character within about 10 to 14 days. So this one, having been undertaken as long as it was, I thought.
Quick. I'm amazed you get Brettanomyces character that quickly.
I think part of it, Ron, is because in Colorado, it's a really weird beast out here, because we can get a fully soured product with a pH of like 2.8 to 2.9 in 3 to 4 months. And so, one of the reasons I think that sour programs are quite successful in Colorado is our humidity is terribly, terribly low. I mean, in the summer, we'll have like 11% humidity, and it promotes, there were a few studies that we were kind of trying to undertake, and we think the low humidity promotes that bacterial activity on a higher level. And we had to be careful, because even after
that's so fucking interesting.
Yes, it's wild. I mean, like, even after 4 months, we would lose 10% of the content in the barrel. We'd have that much evaporate out with them fully bunged. But no, Peter, back to your question, I expected to get more bacterial presence, and it really wasn't. It could be because, at 7.7, that's a pretty good alcohol content. That's, it's up there a little bit. That coupled with the 34 IBUs, I wonder if it really stifled a lot of the microbial activity. And that in itself is like, well, is that what was also going on?
You're completely blowing my mind. I'm having a completely different idea about all this stuff that goes on in beer now.
Yeah.
You bastard! You fucking
way
bastard!
Too flattered that you're saying that, Ron. That coming from you means a lot, for sure.
What strain of Brett? Because we did an exercise here based on a Bass record that I had, which again was pale malt, lots of Goldings, and after the primary fermentation, we gave it some Brettanomyces clauseni, and there's still a dribble of it left in the keg after all these years. So that's now 4 years old.
Yeah.
And we were able to see it. It wasn't funky sour. It was more your Ore Valley
Sure.
smoothness, and it's developed over the years.
Yep.
So I would suspect that your very short period might well be using a different strain of Brett.
It's very possible.
Because
Yeah.
it's led to a beer that is dry as chips.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what was your beer, the one you're drinking there? Is it dry as?
It is quite dry, and I would not be at all surprised if there was some Brett, some Brettanomyces clauseni or clauseni in it, because that is the one that we typically use at the brewery. So our cocktail of Lactopedio and Brett use clauseni. I did not actually inoculate the beer with any Brett because I figured it would, if there was any, it would get picked up in the barrels themselves. Because I did. So interesting with barrel treatment. That's a whole other topic, really. But there were some indications that some brewers, I couldn't find that George Hodgson was doing this, but that some breweries would throw the barrels in boiling water, not fill it with boiling water, but they'd throw them in the vats of boiling water. So they at least had the wherewithal that it was doing some kind of cleansing property to the oak. But what I did with mine was just simply give them a hot rinse. So in between the George Washington Porter and then bringing in some new oak and reusing some oak, the ones that I had used prior, I just shot them with hot water for about a half an hour or so. We had a bidet basically that went up inside the barrel and did a little whippy thing in there, and got it good and clean. And that's all we did. And then I let them sit overnight. So anything that was in the room was going to get into that barrel and maybe do something. Now, I did do all of this in the room where I process our sour beers. So I highly, highly anticipate there was some Brett in those barrels. It may just have been two things: not enough to really do anything, right? Because it's in such a low quantity. Or two, I didn't give it necessarily enough time to actually produce that profile. I love that. Whippy Bidet sounds like a burlesque name. It sure does.
I'm going to, Ron, I'm going to put your video on. It's off because if you're going to swear, I want to fucking see your face doing it.
I thought I'd got my face in. I thought I had my.
No, your video's off, but I just asked you to.
Oh, I thought my video was.
I much prefer it that way. The other thing that strikes me, of course, is that the strain of yeast would have been a multi-strain beast back originally, and you went with a single strain clean yeast, didn't you?
You're absolutely right, and that is the one big thing that I will definitely admit that was going to be the hardest thing for me to do. You know what I mean? Because we're talking 18th century when they probably had a house, they had their house yeast, but what was in that, I have no idea. You know what I mean? And I don't know if anybody does.
Well, I mean, the thing is that even up until now, some British breweries still have pitching yeast that's got lots of stuff in.
Yep.
I mean, Harvey's, what the hell they got in their pitching yeast?
Right. Well, too, Ron,
they've got the Baromyces in there.
Right.
It's a yeast that I've never even heard of.
Right.
That they've got in there.
Well, wasn't that the case with Guinness too for a long time? It was such a concoction of wild stuff that, I mean, I've just heard so many stories that
Guinness were the first people to isolate Brettanomyces in the 1890s, but they didn't tell anyone because it was important. The reason they didn't tell anyone was because it was really important for the way that they did the secondary conditioning, and they didn't want anyone else to know what was involved in this.
Right. Yeah.
It's a Guinness. I mean, what I always say about big breweries is you've got two schools of this. You've got Guinness. You don't tell anyone fucking anything. You've got Carlsberg, who they publish everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yeah, because it's interesting in that regard. And yeah, you're right, Peter. I mean, and that's where when like with the Ales of Antiquity in general, and many of you have heard me say this before. I will never. I know some people that do kind of this experimental archaeology, and they like to boast that they've recreated something from a certain time. And I just don't think anybody can ever do that. Like, if any of my grad students from mechanical engineering are here right now, they know because they got a project coming up where they're reading about this beer that was reproduced that's 5,000 years old in Israel. I'm sure we all heard about this, right? And I have so many problems with it. I think it's great that they isolated this yeast strain and that they're doing something really cool with it and trying to educate the population. But you can't tell me you're recreating a beer that's 5,000 years old because there are just way too many variables at play. And to say that they isolated one yeast strain, to your question, right, Peter? They isolated one yeast strain, they propped it, and they're creating a 5,000-year-old beer. No. I mean, the whole idea of isolating.
Do you know what I always say? I always say, when I always say with all the, I mean, I've done loads of sort of like recreation beers. What I always say to people is, that you can't recreate exactly a clone of the beer as it was.
Right.
But you can get some idea of what the original beer might have been liked by doing a recreation.
Exactly.
And, and that's the best that you can do.
Yeah.
And so I would never ever say that any of the recreation beers I've been involved in exactly cloned a beer from 100 years ago,
right?
Because that's not possible.
No,
you're never going to do that.
Nope.
There's too many variables that don't exist. But you can get
absolutely right, Ron.
But you can get some idea of what that beer was like.
I think we have a topic for a future panel discussion, gentlemen.
Yeah, I mean, it would be really fun because I mean that's because I know Ron, you've been doing stuff with Blue Jacket and things, and with Mike as well out on the East Coast, and yeah, that's exactly right. That's what what I tried to do is give somebody something tangible from history and say this might have been. There are some characteristics here that may be similar, but yeah, to your point, as I like to tell my students too, it's all of us, however many of us are here, 30 something, we all could go home and brew the exact same recipe right now, right? And try to follow all the exact same steps, everything. And we'd all get together and drink them all, and none of them would taste exactly the same. You just can't do it.
Exactly. You haven't got the same brewery. You haven't got the same equipment. You're not doing the same process. But and I realize all this stuff. I realize all the limitations of what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But I still want to make people brew these old fucking recipes of mine. Just say, drink the beers.
Exactly.
I want to get to some other questions here.
Sure.
There's a handful. Jeff wants to know if there is a commercial beer out today that you think might be similar to an 18th century IPA, be it yours or.
Yeah, I agree with Ron. No, the only one to your question, Jeff. Well, actually, I wouldn't even say this. It's actually I don't know. It's probably because when we get it here in the States, it's just so god awful terrible. So maybe it is kind of like beer that had sat in a warehouse for 2 years. But Samuel Smith's makes that historic India Pale Ale, and I think it's just absolutely atrocious. But by the time it gets here, it is so severely oxidized, I can't even hardly drink it. But they boast that it's supposed to be a historic IPA. Ron, you might know more how historic it really is. Or Mark, I don't, it's just not.
And the short answer is no.
I wish there was,
no,
but not really anymore, no.
The only vaguely authentic IPA that's been produced recently is the one I did with Goose Island.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Where we tried to do a proper Goose Island. I really love Goose Island because they're the only people who do all the crazy things that I thought no one would ever do.
Ron, was that the Barnyard beer?
Yeah, the brewery yard beer.
Yeah.
You said barnyard, but it tastes like barnyard. You got it right.
I mean, that's well, the reason I said that, right, it's called Brewery Yard, but the reason I said that is because I remember being at the event and tasting it and listening to you and thinking, and I think several people had mentioned this is very much barnyard, the way sometimes you describe certain wines and things, and it's interesting the two for sure.
Yeah, but Britannomyces, this is the thing. This is the important thing with early IPA. Britannomyces takes everything out of the beer.
Yep.
Really dry. It's the one of the most important things about early IPA is Britannomyces secondary fermentation.
Yeah, exactly. To Peter's point, that's what Peter was saying too. Yeah, it does. It dries it way out. That Brett horsey character.
It's not strictly secondary, Ron. It's tertiary. It's done primary in the open rounds. It's done cleansing in the unions. And now it's tertiary in the barrels, I'll have you know.
Oh, you bastard. You're taking the fucking piss out of me, aren't you?
Mark, I think you had a question. You were going to ask something.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you, well, two things. One, I wanted to know, with your barrel fermenting, did you leave any of them just with an open bung? Or
I did.
Were they all with bubblers on?
Yeah, no, we did leave. So we did a handful of things. So I had 26 of them. 20 of them got with blow off tubes and everything. I was controlling those so that I could get something I could sell essentially. The other 6 barrels, six barrels were used for experiments. So yes, we 2 of them got left completely open bunged. I actually had 1 barrel that I left at 85 degrees the entire time just to see how bad and god awful it would get. It was bad. It was really bad. And then there was one that we never racked overnight. We left it lay on the floor, and the overnight brewers would move it every night. So it never stopped moving essentially for 3.5 months. It actually did not taste bad. It tasted fine, but to Lucas's point earlier, that might have been the original hazy IPA right there, because that thing was so thick. It had so much yeast in suspension. It was like chew it. You had to chew it. But yeah, we did do some different experiments in those regards.
That's good.
Yeah. And we also did
some other guys.
I didn't dry hop them. I left them undry hop to recreate just pale ale, and those were actually really quite nice. Yeah, really nice. Yeah.
The other one that I've been some contact with lately that might be able to start shedding some light on all of this is there's some guys in Belgium that run the sourdough library. Now, normally we have nothing to do with anybody in that world, but they've got the same questions that the Breer people are asking about recreating old yeasts.
Yeah.
And these people, like the Israeli one, where they say, we've done, and no, they've got some really good information on how long they can store yeast without feeding it and what the changes are to it. And they've come up with a magic number of about 3 months. If you dry yeast after 3 months, certain strains become dominant and other strains become disappear from it. So in their opinion, no, you can't scrape a bucket from Viking times and get the yeast off it the same as you can. So they're doing work that's very interesting to us.
That's really, really interesting. Very, very cool. Yeah, keep me posted on that. What else you find out? Really interesting. Yeah, please. That'd be great.
Doug wants to know what the background of the barrels were. And Doug, if you want to feel free to chime in and get more specific or not.
What I meant in terms of, had they been used before? Had they been used for different types of beers? What was the provenance?
Sure. So there was a blend of, there are 2 different types of oak. So I had some English oak, and then I had mostly Virginia white oak barrels. I had bought them actually from Breckenridge Distillery because they accidentally ordered them and nobody would buy them from them. So I'm like, sweet, I got them because these were fresh. They were fresh oak with a medium toast. I didn't want any charred oak for the project, for the original project I did. And so they came in, and I actually brewed a porter in them about 9 months earlier. So I did a recreation of porter that George Washington was purchasing from Alexandria right outside of Washington, D.C. I didn't use all the oak though. So when it came time to do the IPA, I reused those barrels that I had used on George Washington, but I also added in the barrels I didn't use on the first run. So that's what they were. They were all 53-gallon standard size barrels for, no, that's not true. I did, for one of the experiments, I had some French oak barrels that were, I just did it as an experiment. It didn't end up in the final batch, but it was French oak barrels that were used for Cabernet Sauvignon. So I just did a rinse on those and tried to see how they'd turn out. They were fine. There definitely was a wine character to them. That was about it. But that's what the deal was on those oak.
Mark and Grace. First of all, Mark and Grace. I don't know if that's Grace. I can't tell, but
This is Mark.
Oh, hi,
hey,
Mark.
Hey, Travis.
I appreciate. I think that you are the winner for the youngest participant ever on one of the Brewseum virtual happy hours.
That's right.
And you know what I say? Raise them right.
That's
Appreciate that.
That's right.
You said you have a
Thank you.
question about elevation.
Yeah, so I had a question for you, Travis, just regarding the elevation factor that went into the brewery process. I know that we're at a mile high here, so
Right.
I was curious how that affected it, if at all, and how you took that into effect versus how they were brewing it back in the day.
That is an excellent question, Mark. Mark's a former student of mine, so good to see you, Mark, and good to see the kiddos. I haven't seen them yet. So
Good to see you. Ken, say hi.
Hi. Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. So in regards to the elevation, yeah, I mean, there's very little I could do that would replicate, obviously, the fact that London is at a far lower elevation. They're practically barely above sea level in comparison to us. Yeah, that in Boulder, we sit at like, what is it, like 5,600 feet? We're a little over a mile high, I think, in Boulder. And so, so there's very little I could do to really recreate anything that would give me a proper elevation. I will say, though, it does affect the beer undoubtedly. So, we actually know that yeast and bacteria will act differently at a higher elevation. We do have different turnaround times on our fermentations as a result. We also boil at a lower temperature. So our boils are about 202 degrees Fahrenheit. So, all of those things where we're still like trying to create the same process or product, there is an effect there. So to be honest, I couldn't really do much to take that into effect. The only other major climatic thing that I could affect was humidity. And as I was saying earlier, humidity in Colorado is, is super, super low, except for like today where it's only 5 degrees out and snowing.
Exactly.
But in regards to humidity, when it's super, super low, it also causes issues or can promote things like with a souring beer really, really fast. So I kept them all in a humidity controlled room, and humidity was held at right around 40%, 38 to 40% humidity the entire time. And that seems to have helped quite a bit. But yeah, it's a good question, Mark.
Awesome. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay. We're going to take these last two questions. We have been at this for 95 minutes, and I appreciate all you nerds sticking around this long to hang out and chat some IPA history. Two questions from Ron via Facebook. A, what was the final pH of packaging? And B, any thoughts on the story that these original IPAs were sometimes diluted with water in India to reduce the ABV?
Both excellent questions. Yeah, Ron, in regards to the finishing pH, we did not measure it, I'll be honest. So that's a good question. I did not take a final pH measure on it. My guess, I'd hate to even fathom a guess and be far, far off, but beer is fairly acidic, it just in its own right. But I can't imagine that the pH is much different than kind of your standard IPA. Just drinking it right now, it has, there is no sour content really to it whatsoever. So I'm guessing the pH, might be, I don't know, what's your standard IPA, Ron or Peter, or one of you guys might know better, maybe like 4.5, I suppose, something like that. I'm not really sure off the top of my head. And then in regards to diluting IPAs, that's a good question. I don't know, Ron. Where I stand, I mean, I should say, like, I do know of this, I do know of the comment or the story of it or the references to it possibly happening. I don't really know where I stand on it. I wouldn't doubt it, to be honest. At the same time, I guess why? You know, because I don't think the ABVs on these was terribly high. I think it was probably somewhere in that 7% range.
Yeah, I don't think they watered it down in NGO.
Yeah, I guess I just don't know why you would do it.
Yeah,
So,
why would they?
Yeah.
It wasn't that strong a beer in the first place. Why would you water it down?
Right. Yeah, and then Liz, did you say there was another one? Oh, one just came in.
All right, we'll do one more.
Okay. Sorry.
Let's see. Being unfiltered, would the suspended yeast in the barrel help resist oxidation? Would it be negligible?
I don't think so. If any, I don't think it would have resisted the oxidation. I don't really think that's going to have the same effect. If anything, all of that yeast in suspension, I think, had the potential for it to be much, much worse, to be honest. You know, yeast in suspension too. I keep coming back to Lucas's question because it cracked me up. Should these be IPAs or not? You know, it's funny because with the really a trend with really hazy IPAs today is they do all kinds of things to them. They'll put oats are often put in them to keep them hazy. Yeah, obviously, as you guys know, lactose is put in some of them. They're literally milkshake IPAs. All these things, and really in the end, what you end up with is a bunch of yeast in suspension, and that's what gives you the raging hangovers. I can attest to it. Drink like 4 of those in one sitting and then wake up the next morning and you're just like, Jesus, what did I do last night? You know, and a lot of it's all that yeast in suspension. And also some of the most severely oxidized beers I've ever smelled were hazy beers that had a lot of yeast in suspension. So I don't
blame the yeast. Yay.
Yeah. That's right. Yep.
I mean, I think that's an amazing way to conclude.
I think so too.
Blaming the yeast. Yeah, not the drinker. Listen, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Travis, always awesome.
Oh, my pleasure.
For us.
This has been real cool. I've got a whole list of points I wanted to make here, which I haven't bothered doing because I've just had a blast.
Email me, Ron, and we'll sit down over a couple of beers and chat about it.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to do a part 2.
Yeah, we
with
should.
Ron and Mark and all of you fun blokes out there. Yeah. So thank you.
I got hazy gin.
Hey, there you go.
I got hazy.
Hey, it's Friday. I'm ready for some.
If I'm not drinking
this wasn't
beer,
supposed to come out like this. This is last week's gin, and it's got a tiny haze to it. I don't like that. I'll have to go again.
Thank you all very much for joining us again and for sticking around to do this. We have a lot happening this year. We haven't shared what's happening yet, but we will. So for more information about us and to keep up to date with events and other news, please go to our website, chicagobrewseum.org. You can follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter @ShyBrewseum. Many of the fine folks here, like I said, are involved in this project and doing some fun stuff. And we have a lot of just really, really cool things in the hopper. Had to do it for you all. So thank you for your support. We will see you again very soon. We actually just posted a brand new event for, I believe it is Saturday, March 6th, about beer identity nationalism in the Habsburg Empire by one of our other League of
fucking brilliant. That's really, is it Andres Krenmeyer?
It's Allison Orton.
All right.
Who'll be doing a talk about beer Pilsner in
the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yes,
is one of the things I'm completely obsessed with.
There's a lot of things, Ron. I'm starting to. I wonder how you have the time, honestly. Anyway, thank you all again for joining us. We will catch you for sure on March 6th, and then in other ways.
It's been really cool.
in the future.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, guys. Next time.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks. Thanks,
Bye.
y'all. Thanks, Travis. Thanks, Liz.
You bet.
See ya. Cheers.